From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Libya. We'll be discussing the new government, the complex regional and international dynamics at play, and the path ahead. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got two great guests joining us to help make sense of things. Jonathan Winer and Mirette Mabrouk. Jonathan is a scholar at MEI and has served in a number of roles with the U.S. government, including as Special Envoy for Libya and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement. Mirette is a Senior Fellow and the head of MEI's Egypt program. Jonathan, Mirette, welcome back to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan, let's start with you. At long last, Libya has a new prime minister, Abdul Hamid Deiba, and a new interim government, the so-called Government of National Unity, which was sworn in just about a month ago in mid-March. For our listeners who don't follow Libya quite as closely as the two of you, what should they know about the new PM and the new government? What are the kind of main challenges facing them and the key items on their agenda moving forward?
Well, this is a unity government. It was selected by a Libyan political dialogue forum that was created by the UN for the purpose of getting an interim government in place that could lead to elections. And the new prime minister comes from a family that was very involved with construction and contracting under Gaddafi. So it's a familiar group of people in terms of his family to lots of parts of Libyan society and to key states who have been involved in the Libyan conflict. So you have Turkey on the one hand feeling comfortable. You have Egypt on the other hand feeling comfortable. You can see outreach by the new government to both of those competing forces. You have Greece, which was very upset about the Turkish role, coming in to Tripoli to meet with the new prime minister. And essentially what's going on right now is there's a lot of jockeying to see how much they can deliver in contracts to which companies involving which foreign sponsors. Everybody feel they're getting benefits from the interim government. And then there's jockeying to see whether, in fact, elections are going to go ahead December 24th, 2021, as they're supposed to do, and whether there's any give there that's being pushed out a little bit. So far, the foreign countries involved in Libya are all saying we expect the elections to go ahead. The UN Security Council said that quite recently, unanimously. So right now, things are sunny and bright and good, and everybody's happy. The members of the new government come from the west of the country, the east of the country, the south of the country. It's all exquisitely balanced, and it's business-oriented. The question of corruption is in the air. There's always a question as to who's making money off of it. And we'll see how that evolves, but there are lots of people watching too.
Mirette, building on what Jonathan said, how are the new PM and the new government perceived in Cairo, and what are Egypt's current priorities when it comes to Libya?
All right, so the new government is perceived quite well. Egypt's foreign policy is, generally speaking, nothing if not pragmatic. Now, just before Dbeibeh was elected or chosen, if you like, by the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, Egypt had been extremely worried about a couple of things. It had been worried that the dialogue would fail. Now, if you remember this, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, that was put together by the United Nations, and it brought together representatives from various Libyan factions who were going to try and put the country back together after it had been splintered after the 2014 elections and after the fact that the Government of National Accord, which had been backed by the UN, failed to receive a vote of confidence. And Egypt had been backing, must be said, fairly begrudgingly, Khalifa Haftar, not as many people think because they wanted a military guy, but because for a bunch of other reasons, one of them being that they were worried about the Islamists. So they were worried that the Libyan political dialogue would fail, and they were also worried that Haftar during this process might launch a renewed attack on the West. Blessedly, that didn't happen, and Dbeibeh was he was a surprise choice because the favorites had been the GNA Interior Minister Fathi Bashagha and Aguila Saleh, whose star had been rising over the past year and a half. But Dibeba came through. And Egypt is absolutely fine with that. Egypt is keen on maintaining relations with Syria for various reasons. One is that long, porous border, so security is also important, but also economics is a major facet in the relationship with Libya. Dibeba has friends in the Egyptian business community. When Dibeba came in and met with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, there was a long, flowery statement, but basically the focus was on building, I quote, strong future relations anchored in economic cooperation. So there is that. And the other thing, of course, is and while he was there, of course, the Egyptians helped set up various meetings with their fists for him. And, that they are looking to get their foot back through the door, and they're looking to try and consolidate their influence, which had waned a bit. And they're having to compete with the UAE, with Russia, with France, with Turkey. So they're really very, very comfortable about this, and they've got their nose to the grindstone, and they're ploughing forward.
Right, beyond Egypt, what has the response been like elsewhere in the region in, say, Tunisia and Algeria?
Pretty good. Tunisia is easier to sort out than Algeria. Tunisia, you have to remember, borders Libya and is small, defenseless, and has been largely overrun with Libyan refugees, some of them with significantly more spending power than the average Tunisian has. So, secure Libya is important for a secure and stable Tunisia. And Tunisia has good relations with Egypt and has been very, very supportive of the entire move.
Jonathan, where does this leave Khalifa Haftar, the head of the self styled Libyan National Army?
Well, Haftar has been told, it appears, that he's in position to lead a unified Libyan army. And that's been an offer to him off and on for a very long time for a lot of countries. And he can then run for office if he wants to. It's not clear exactly where he's going to wind up. His view, built on decades of experience, is that if he's not running things, he's at risk. That the only place for him is at the top. That's the only safe place, and that's the only good place. He lost his effort to become dictator of Libya, and his sponsors got very angry with him along the way, and that included Egypt and Russia. He treated Putin with disrespect, and the Egyptians viewed him as very hard to handle and ultimately somebody they could completely trust. So he's been bruised by all of this. He's being cosseted with the idea that he might wind up in charge of the army, which of course would be a very powerful position for him to potentially then take over in the future. So he's been quiet so far, and where he's going to head ultimately, it's not clear. I'm very interested in how Mirette thinks Egypt is thinking about Haftar at this point.
So I actually think you put your finger on it. Egypt is extremely wary of Haftar. While the Geneva negotiations were happening, they essentially had their hands on their hearts, waiting for him to pull off another attack. Well, they don't think he's reliable at all, and they are worried. They did not want the initial military incursion into Libya, into Tripoli. They thought that was a huge mistake, and went ahead and did it anyway. And they're worried about him. They don't think that he's a stable partner, and Egypt is concerned above all with security and prosperity, probably in that order. And Khalifa Haftar does not seem to be somebody who is massively interested in placing those things at the forefront. At the forefront appears to be, his own particular political ambitions, as Jonathan said. So they're not in the slightest bit attached to him.
Jonathan, looking beyond the immediate region, among the many external actors that have become involved in Libya in recent years are the UAE and Russia. You touched on them very briefly at the beginning. And both of them have been, in the past, major backers of Haftar. Where do they stand vis a vis the new government?
Well, Haftar lost Russia in January 2020 when Putin wanted him to attend a peace conference and agree to a ceasefire, and Haftar simply took off. You don't do that to Vladimir Putin and have him say, oh, that's okay. It was a fundamental miscalculation by Haftar because it showed a lack of respect for Putin as a major world leader. And Haftar was making a point, which is nobody tells him what to do. And since then, my impression has been while Russia very much wants to continue to be an important actor in Libya and is maintaining its military presence there, they have been part of the boomlet for Aguila as an alternative figure from the East to help deliver the East and keep their influence in the East as an alternative to Haftar. And that they're perfectly open to alternatives. They've also been looking at Saif Gaddafi and his potential for the future. And there's been an aroma of that in the air for some time. So they have been part of the solution as Turkey and Egypt clearly didn't want to go to war over Khalifa Haftar's ambitions. And Russia wants to have a presence and influence rather than to be associated with somebody it can't trust and who's lost. So right now, Russia is being part of the solution while it's still maintaining its military presence, which makes it part of the problem. And where it will ultimately land is not clear. Now, the Emirates is a different matter. The Emirates clearly made a calculated decision to support Haftar to see if he could become a dictator and replicate el-Sisi's control of Egypt in Libya and thus kill forever the idea of a Muslim Brotherhood government that might have Libya's wealth to back it and to export Muslim Brotherhood-ism to other countries like in the Gulf. And with that, basically the big fear, the question is, can the Emirates live with the current government or something like it? And the answer to that is clearly yes. This is a business-oriented government of people who did business and issued contracts under Gaddafi and are doing it again. It's not ideological. It does come out of Misrata, which has had a strong Muslim Brotherhood presence and has sometimes been called Islamist by the Emiratis. But these people are not that. So for the Emirates, it's looking decent. They themselves have lots of questions and issues about Haftar. He hasn't always done what they've wanted either. He's not going to be controlled by anyone ultimately, for better and for worse. And the Emirates know that the Biden administration, unlike the Trump administration, is not going to take its direction on Libya from them. It is not easy to manipulate and wants to have peace in Libya, not inspired, regional supported, a toxic interference that creates local conflict. And so all of that would be reasons for the Emirates to pull back and to see if they can live with the result of this government of national unity and with what happens next with elections at the end of the year.
Mirette, the other major outside actor involved here is, of course, Turkey. Prime Minister Dbeba's first official visit was to Turkey earlier this week, and during the trip, he upheld the controversial maritime border agreement the Government of National Accord, the GNU's predecessor, had signed with Ankara in late 2019, a deal that's been disputed by both Greece and Cyprus. How significant is that decision in your view, and what does it suggest?
The announcement was interesting. Now, that 2019 agreement was disputed by Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt, all three countries of which pointed out that it didn't have any international law legs to stand on, but it doesn't really matter. The fact that Dbeba, has said that Libya would like to uphold this agreement, it depends on which context you view it in. If you view it in the context that Dbeba might possibly be probably referred to as a consensus candidate, and that there are allegedly elections coming up in December, then the idea possibly might be not to rock too many boats. Okay, because he's not going to have to do anything about this maritime agreement, and it is, by the way, an agreement that is going to be almost impossible to uphold. It's going to be extremely difficult to get anything to come to fruition out of that agreement. So it's not a huge risk. Also, you want to bear in mind that President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had said that they would be delighted to support Libya. They would be delighted to support, and this is important, the reconstruction and the military. Libya is sending COVID vaccines, I think maybe 150,000, and has said that it will manage a pandemic hospital in Tripoli to help Libya battle its COVID outbreak. Okay, Turkey wants to be involved in Libya, and Biba doesn't see any reason to try and tick off the Turks. It's not necessary. And you want to bear something in mind as well. When this, again, Dabiba's focus clearly is economic. It's sort of what the man does. And you want to bear in mind that during that visit, along with the 150,000 doses of COVID vaccine, they signed 5 agreements, including one for an electricity plant. So this is about economic cooperation, and it's about trying to maintain relations with as many of your neighbors as possible, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. So that's probably the light in which you want to look at it in.
I like to follow that up because if you look at what's happening with Greece at the same time as you look at what's happening with Turkey, Turkey is getting contracts for, as part of the $22 billion Libya is going to spend under its new budget. And so the goal of Turkey, which is economic activity and political influence, achieved, check that box. The maritime thing cannot happen. Greece will never allow it to happen. And what got announced in the middle of April is that Greece and Libya have now agreed to hold talks on marking out their maritime zones in the Mediterranean. The Prime Minister of Greece has just announced it, with another member of Libya's Presidency Council, a fellow named Mohammed Al-Menfi, who had been Libya's ambassador to Greece before. So they're going to talk this through on the Greek side. To have the Prime Minister engage on the Greek side at the same time that you're having the president engage on the Turkish side is pretty impressive all the way around. It suggests that there are going to be efforts at alignment to have win, 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 as opposed to lose, 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 lose. It's all being greased by the economic opportunities of Libya returning to being a country that's able to generate wealth from oil and spend it.
Following up on that point, as you reference, one of the other big points of contention among the external actors is involvement in any future reconstruction deals, including both winning contracts and providing labor. Turkey seems to be benefiting so far, but who else is well situated under the new government?
This is something that Egypt and Turkey are going to slug it out for, because traditionally there had always been Egyptian laborers in Libya, always, and they are vital for remittances and all that. But Egypt is sort of past that. It's not interested just in labor; it's interested in reconstruction contracts, which is where the big money is. All right, and again, you want to bear in mind there was a reason why when Biba visited Cairo, the Egyptian government set him up with a bunch of former Qaddafists to have talks, because these people are all heavily plugged into the economic scene, both the Libyans and the Egyptians together, and that's what it's all about. It's about those contracts. Now, Turkey is going to do its best, but you want to bear something in mind as well. Turkey has changed its, formerly haranguing tone towards Egypt. This is not new. I mean, periodically, a high-ranking Turkish official would come out and say something polite about trying to renew relations with Egypt, and then President Erdogan would come out and say something deeply offensive personally about President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. However, there has been a distinct change. And one of the most relevant changes has been that Turkey has asked various members of the Muslim Brotherhood who had been broadcasting in Turkey to stop slagging off the Egyptian government, has promised the Egyptian government that it's not going to be giving citizenship to many of these people, which is extremely important. And of course, when the Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal, the Turks offered to help. So there does seem to be action on the, movements on the ground for a sort of slightly more harmonious Eastern Mediterranean. So it makes the slugging it out for contracts significantly more civilized, but no less competitive.
I think that the only thing to add is that previously China had a lot of contracts in Gaddafi's Libya, and that's a place that we may hear of again. The Chinese may engage. But the basic notion of having Turkey and Egypt competing for contracts and both getting them and having workers come in support of those contracts is really a plus plus. It's good for everyone. What a great way to have them compete, as opposed to having them using lethal force, in which a whole lot of Libyans are getting killed and the country basically gets shut down. We're in a remarkably better place than we were a year ago.
Oh, just to add, you probably don't want to exclude the French from that. The French are super keen on coming to the fore on just about everything, but certainly they have overly active interest in Libya.
Well, France and Italy are both going to continue to compete in terms of oil in the oil sector.
Yes.
In terms of who gets contracts going forward for their international companies.
Yes.
But they're not, I think, going to be competing as much for contracts from the Libyan government, except there. So it's slightly different. Seeing France and Italy aligned, as opposed to supporting different factions, is another positive from the current period, which is different from where it was a year ago.
Yeah.
Jonathan, foreign fighters from a number of different countries remain on the ground in Libya. A recently released UN report pointed the finger at Egypt, Russia, the UAE, Turkey, and Qatar, among other countries, as major backers of foreign forces. Everyone seems to agree that they need to leave, and the sooner the better. But what is it likely to take to make that happen, and how realistic is that in the near term?
Well, there's three different ways it can happen. First, the Libyans can tell them, we really want you to leave. We're not going to be hospitable. And there will be consequences for your contracts, for example. If you try to stay, we don't want you here now. Now, in order for them to say that to Turkey, for example, they would have to see that the Emirati forces and the Egyptian forces were backing off. So it requires some consultation outside of Libya involving some neutral forces also pushing at the same time as the Libyans do. And this is the action that the Biden administration is particularly suited for. Biden administration is not the Trump administration. That discontinuity provides an opportunity for the United States to say, well, we're here now. Biden administration's here. We're really serious. We want you to leave. Now, the only ones that really doesn't work for, because Turkey and the Emirates and Egypt do have an interest in keeping the United States reasonably happy. Not massively happy necessarily, not completely happy, but reasonably happy. So they're going to take it into account. But what about Russia? Well, Russia is really going to have to get the message from Libyans that it's no longer comfortable here. One of the way that can happen is, you can always have an area walled off where ingress and egress starts getting difficult. There's lots of forms of petty harassment that people can do when they don't want, when a house guest has stayed too long, to indicate that it's time for the house guest to go elsewhere. And ultimately, Russia's going to take its signals, I think, from Libyans rather than from foreigners and deciding what's comfortable and what isn't.
Jonathan, a number of high-level European officials have touched down in Libya in recent weeks. Beyond the optics of such visits, how important is Libya on the European foreign policy agenda at present?
Well, there's a negative side and a positive side. The positive side is they would very much like to see Italy and France in particular, as we've discussed, oil being produced and their oil companies being able to participate in it. On the negative side, they don't want thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of refugees coming. They don't want terrorists getting a safe haven. They want to be able to maintain some kind of security in Libya that discourages terrorism. And from that combination of agendas, you see an absolute delight that there's a respite from the catastrophe that took place in 2019 and 2020, and that there's a different place. So it's in Europe's interest for there to be a stable Mediterranean and a stable Maghreb, a stable North Africa. And stability in Libya helps with all of that. So it helps politically, It helps economically, and it helps in security terms. And so it's not surprising. People are going to want to paint big smiles on their faces and do everything they can to make it work. Where there's risk is if somebody decides to act out, terrorists, or, for example, General Haftar or any other security actor, on the one hand, or if you start seeing such signs of corruption in the construction space that it starts imperiling the ability of the country to move ahead economically. And those are twin risks. The third risk, and this is the big one, is that everybody decides they like the interim government so much with all those contracts coming out that there's a movement to delay elections. And I think that would imperil the legitimacy of everything that's taken place. Those elections do need to happen. And amidst all the happy talk, there needs to be continued focus that is not very many months away. That's essentially 8 months, 7 months, 7.5 months. And that's going to need to happen. And there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. Everybody's formal position is it's going to happen. And in fact, it needs to happen.
Jonathan, closer to home, how is the Biden administration approaching Libya so far, and what are your expectations in the coming months?
In the first days that they took office, immediately, they said support for UN, opposition to foreign forces. They refer to the foreign forces as toxic interference. They told everybody to cut it out. And they're messaging, I believe, like crazy along the lines that you heard from Mirette and from me in the course of this conversation. Get your forces out, support a unity government that's inclusive, let Libya move forward, and support elections so that we have a legitimate government that's going to be able to go on for some period of time. How much they're going to do at a high level, at the Secretary of State level, the presidential, vice presidential level, national security advisor level, I can't tell yet because there's so much work the Biden administration has to do so quickly. But the signaling has clearly been sent and consistent with the public messages. It's unity, courtesy, non-bloody mindedness, get your militaries out, work things out through diplomacy and agreement and compromise.
Mirette, looking ahead to the rest of 2021, what are the main issues or developments in Libya that will be of particular importance for Egypt?
Okay, so to follow Jonathan's lead of putting down points, Egypt is interested in the following: security, economic development, and regional influence. All right. So it's important to Egypt to, at the moment, try and establish a presence in Tripoli because that might help make up for what it lost in Cyrenaica. And when Sisi met with Dbeibeh, he did. I understand that he did point out that they were keen to support Libya on absolutely anything as long as Egypt's security was not imperiled in any way. Now, the problem is that's a little bit easier said than done because maintaining Egypt's security might have it rub up against the other players in the field, whether they're Russia, the UAE, or even the US. And Egypt is very keen at the moment to try and position itself as someone that the US can refer to and lean on in Libyan affairs. And considering that this administration doesn't seem to have as cuddly a relationship as the last one, they're very, very keen to try and set that right. And you want to also bear in mind that Egypt's always maintained a good relationship with the Qaddafists, but they're also trying to improve their relationships with Russia and align with them. They're trying to improve their relationships with Turkey and with Tripoli. They want to try and make sure that Haftar is not booted too hard because I think they're under the impression that a wounded Haftar is a dangerous Haftar, and Egypt has a strong interest in the reconstruction of the Libyan armed forces. So they will be looking to the elections to see what happens. I think the idea at the moment is that while the elections should take place in December 24th, I think, might not be a bad idea if there was a little bit of continuity for a bit to try and get all of these boats straightened. So for Egypt, at the moment, sort of slow and steady does it as far as the Libyans are concerned, but a great deal of maneuvering on the Egyptians' part.
Jonathan, we're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to conclude just by touching on the elections again as an issue. How optimistic are you about that process?
I think I am agnostic or cautious about whether it's going to take place without struggle. The internationals and the Security Council have been very clear that it needs to take place. The legitimacy of this government is legitimacy for this year. Things are at risk of going to hell if anyone tries to extend the current government without elections. But in Libya, there are always spoilers, and the spoilers tend to try and find a government that thinks it doesn't, a foreign government that thinks it doesn't like where things are going, to enable them to spoil, as long as the foreign governments can stay together and insist that there be elections, and that the major candidates for elections are roughly acceptable to the broad range of foreign interests, as well as the broad range of Libyans, we could have a success here. It's just there will be bumps along the road, and there is no alternative but to having it then. And we just have to continue to take that point of view internationally. There is no alternative. The last elections in Libya were in 2014. Now that is 7 years ago. That's a long time. The people of Libya need to be able to express their will and have that reflected in their next government.
I don't mean that the Egyptians will be actively agitating or even overly keen on the the elections not happening and having the resulting backlash from that. I think what I want to say is they will be keen on seeing some sort of continuity, but not the kind of continuity that means that the elections have not been held and then you start this whole mess all over again.
There's no appetite, as near as I can tell, for further Libyan civil war with risk of regional conflict. And that's a very good lesson from the past couple of years.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but we'll be watching this issue closely going forward. Mirette, Jonathan, thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.